each with experience in the public sector of their own economies, and we also have equally 4 distinguished discussants, equally well from international, if not from all continents. So the session starts, and I invite the first speaker, Mr. Dr. Otiv Igbuzor, who is the Executive Director of the African Center for Leadership, Strategy and Development. He currently works as the Honorable Commissioner of Police, or of the Police Service Commission, and has published many scholarly articles. He's a fellow of the Nigerian Institute of Strategic Management. Dr. Igbuzor.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you, participants, for your resilience. I've been asked to speak on state-owned enterprises reconstruction policy implementation in Africa. So this presentation is focused essentially on what we've been discussing since morning, but with a focus on Africa. Now, in this presentation, what I want to do is to first show the extensive public sector involvement in African economy before the rise of unbridled neoliberalism, and also to identify the factors responsible for privatization of SOEs in Africa, and then show the magnitude of the privatization of SOE in Africa. I will argue in this presentation that Africa as a continent had the largest share of privatization of SOEs as a result of rise of neoliberalism from the Washington Consensus that happened in the 80s. But it has been documented that all the success stories, and I think this is the point, all the success stories share a commitment from the state to adopt a proper institutional framework that allows for effective and efficient management. And like I mentioned earlier, the decision of a state to restructure state-owned enterprises or to privatize them is a political decision. It has nothing to do with the performance or otherwise of the state-owned enterprises. Because if there is poor performance, what needs to be done is to look at the causes of the poor performance and turn the poor performance around, as we have seen from the success story of Kerala. The challenge is how to develop the political commitment to build a resurgence of state-owned enterprises in Africa. Now, as I mentioned earlier, at independence, Africa recognized the importance of strategy and development planning. And so, if you look at the development trajectory of Africa, there were a lot of progress in the 1960s and 1970s. And this period also coincided with a period of serious centralized planning and strategy development. That is why scholars have referred to the 1960s and 1970s as the golden period of planning in the African continent. On the other hand, with the resurgence of neoliberalism in Africa, development slowed down in Africa. That is why some scholars have referred to the 1980s and the 1990s as the lost development decades for Africa. In the 60s and 70s, there were a lot of state-owned enterprises in Africa, and the extensive public sector involvement in the economy was reinforced by the fact that many, if not most, of the first generation of new African leaders were ideologically predisposed to government control of the commanding heights of the economy. Like I mentioned earlier, in the 80s and 90s, there was an emergence of privatization of state-owned enterprises in Africa. And several factors have been adduced to be responsible for this. First and foremost is the rise of aggressive right-wing governments in the United Kingdom, represented by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and the United States, represented by Ronald Reagan, which, of course, has been discussed this morning as the Washington Consensus. The second is deregulation and marketization was seen by many governments as a way to adjust to the impact of the oil price hike of 1973 to 74. And the third factor is the impact of globalization and IT revolution, which gave rise to idle capital that market fundamentalists thought could be put to good use in privatization. The fourth reason, which is actually the reason that many of the neoliberal scholars give, is that many state-owned enterprises in Africa were performing very poorly and were in need of reconstruction. Privatization seemed to be the neoliberal only answer to this particular problem. And so, as a result of these factors, privatization was implemented vigorously in almost all African countries in the 80s and 90s. And using the poor performance as an excuse, the international financial institutions initiated the structural adjustment programs in Africa, such that from 1979 to 1989, the World Bank approved worldwide 98 structural adjustment programs with state-owned enterprises-related components. And African cases accounted for 70% of the total World Bank state-owned enterprises-related adjustments in the 1980s. The World Bank has documented that the total number of privatization transactions rose from 200 in 1990 to 3,486 in 2002. The end result of all of these are job losses, increase in price of services, and primitive accumulation by the ruling class of the collective wealth of the people. But there is a ray of hope, because there are success factors coming from Africa, in spite of the assault of privatization on state-owned enterprises in Africa. As at 2005, in half of African countries, the water, fixed-line telephone, railways, airplanes, and petroleum product distribution sectors are all still state-owned and operated companies. And despite the poor performance of many SOEs in Africa, there are still many examples of African state-owned enterprises that perform very well. The Ethiopian airline that brought me from Nigeria through Addis Ababa to Mumbai, the Kenyan Tea Development Authority, the Sierra Leone's Guma Valley Water Corporation. A case study of the success story of South Africa. I'm using South Africa as a success story because of the position they have taken as a country. My argument earlier is that the position a country takes determines what it does, whether it will reconstruct or reform state-owned enterprises or take to outright privatization. South Africa has taken the position that they require a strong democratic developmental state, and a basic requirement of the developmental state is the strengthening of state-owned enterprises. The Reconstruction and Development Program of South Africa provides that government decide on balance of evidence whether the public sector should be expanded in strategic areas through nationalization, purchasing, a shareholding in companies, establish new public corporations, joint ventures with the private sector. The South Africa started a program of restructuring of SOEs, including redesign of business management principles, turnaround strategies, improving efficiency and effectiveness, assessing globally competitive technologies, attracting foreign direct investment, and ensuring growth in employment. The end result is that substantial revenue accrued to the state from state-owned enterprises. And the restructuring and internal organization brought good financial results for many state-owned enterprises in South Africa, including Transnet, South African Airways, Spornet, Denel, Eskom, and Telkom. Now the success story of Botswana, another country in Africa. It has been documented that Botswana is well known for its remarkable economic growth with the highest level of per capita growth of any country in the last 35 years. That is until 2001. The success story of Botswana is attributed to effective state management. And the success story of Botswana, which depends on a single mineral gold, is markedly different from Nigeria, which also depends on a single mineral resource, oil. The difference is in the state capacity. The phenomenon of resource cost that is applicable to Nigeria is not applicable to Botswana, and the difference is in the state capacity. It has been shown that the development crisis in many African countries is compounded by the profound weakness in the capacity of the state. To conclude, I offer the following 5 suggestions. Reconstruction of the African state to become a developmental state, political, ideological, and economic struggle against neoliberalism in all its ramifications in Africa, vigorous dissemination of the success stories of Kerala and other success stories of state-owned enterprises across the world and in Africa, linkage and with other movements such as the anti-globalization movement and the World Social Forum process, and support for the resurgence of state-owned enterprises in Africa. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Igbuzor. Thank you also for sticking to your time, which the organizers have told me is very important. Thank you very much indeed. We have the next speaker, Mr. Philip Ko, a professional from the law domain. He has worked extensively with the Global Corporate Governance Forum, and is a founder board member of the Malaysian Institute of Corporate Governance. He is currently senior partner of Messrs. Ma Kamaria and Philip Ko, a leading law firm having strengths in corporate securities law, cross-border investments, corporate finance, and banking. Philip Ko.
Thank you, Mr. Balakrishnan. I have no PowerPoints because someone said that sometimes you may have PowerPoints, but there's no power and there's no point. But in this case, I was not quite prepared for a whole session of Asian reflection. I thought I'll take this opportunity to expand on some of the comments I made in the earlier session. But I'll take the 4 headings of the OECD report as a mediating platform for my comments, and making some remarks about Malaysian experience and casting an eye over Singapore, Temasek, with some comments there too. The 4 major headings I like to, 4 or 5 major headings I like to touch on is, when you talk about public enterprise or state-owned enterprise, we need to look at the legal and regulatory framework of which it is found. 2, we need to look at the state as an active shareholder and not a passive one. 3, we need to, what do you mean by how do we treat shareholders if that particular state-owned enterprise takes the form of a corporatized entity? And in the experience of Malaysia and Singapore, for example, we have listed corporations on the exchange. And 4th, we need to look at the stakeholders, of which clearly state-owned enterprise is not just about return of shareholder value, but as to the other stakeholders. And finally, the 2 other remaining points, disclosure issues, transparency in the reporting requirements, either in Parliament or in the financial media. And the final point is towards an effective board of a state-owned enterprise. Now, the first point that I would like to touch on is the legal character of a state-owned enterprise. This is not something that we should ignore. In Malaysia, it's clear enough that state-owned enterprise has essentially been corporatized, not necessarily privatized in some instance. In some instance, there was privatization, but there's corporatization, and it has its form under the Ordinary Companies Act and listing requirements and capital securities market laws. And therefore, it has an ability to sue and to be sued. And directors are fiduciary, imposed with high standard of care and skill, as may have been developed through the corporate governance discourse, both judicially and through the various codes and accounting standards. So for Malaysia and Singapore, for example, all the SOEs that has been corporatized takes the form of the Companies Act incorporated entity and bound by the various rules. And so they are easily transparent and accountable in accordance to common law notions similar to the Indian Corporation Act and common law of contract law. Now, in terms of that issue, therefore, it is clear that under the Companies Act, the agency principle arises. Jomo talks about that. Whether you call it a public sector enterprise or a private, the agency problem is pervasive. Directors are agents, but they are imperfect agents. Under the short time I spent with Oliver Hart, they have incomplete contracts with their principals and therefore never fully maximize or optimize their discharge of their duties. And we need to make clear, therefore, these duties, and that's the last point on effective board. The issue of state as a shareholder, as I listen into the conversations throughout the day today, I think we realize that state-owned enterprise plays such a dominant role in ASEAN countries and in the East Asia. All right, for Malaysia, for example, the capitalization of state-owned enterprise on the exchange is well over 50% of the capitalization of the exchange. For China, it's about 20-30. All right, Singapore equally is about 20, and therefore they play a very ubiquitous role. The state now is an active shareholder, and what does it mean to play an active shareholder role in terms of this state-owned enterprise that has been corporatized? For Singapore, for example, the OECD reported, and we are aware, Temasek now has an aggregate financial report as to their holdings. YRK already talk about sovereign funds, and Temasek and Khazanah are sovereign funds, and they are making a play in cross-border investments. For Malaysia, one of our favorite pastime is having some critical comment about Singapore. And so here comes one, all right? Because we are quite envious of their success. Being easier to manage, they are an island state whilst we are a nation. In Singapore, they made some various brilliant investments, they thought. For example, in China, all right, we are well known of the loss of almost about 9 to 10 billion, all right, Singapore dollars, or rather a deterioration of the asset when they went to China, because the then senior minister, Lee Kuan Yew, thought that when they sorted out with Beijing, and they could go to the provincial government, and it's fine, because Beijing determines everything. But it is not true, because the local mayor and the governor in the particular province also have a play in the whole investment dynamics. And Singapore made some misjudgments, planting in a huge industrial park there, which the governor of that province welcomed Beijing, and when they went away, the governor opened up another competing industrial park next to the industrial park and put the water and electricity first, there in that own state government province. Similarly, Singapore made a colossal misjudgment. We are well aware of that, the ShinCorp issue, all right? When they bought a huge block of a satellite company from former Thaksin. And we begin to realize intelligence alone, all right? Singaporeans are very intelligent, all right? Do not determine success outcomes when you make investment decisions. As I overheard Mr. Radha just now talking about the Nehru port. Yes, there are business judgments and sometimes painful misjudgments which can cause, and state ownership have to take a kind of a business judgment evaluation also. You cannot judge your managerial officers too harshly if it is in fact merely a business judgment or misjudgment and not a fraudulent bad faith decision. Otherwise, the tenure of their position is very, very weak. In terms of a corporatized entity in Khazanah Holdings, Malaysia, for example, I'm talking about shareholders now, it is clear that they allow, and Khazanah and the holding company, the GLCs, through PNB and Pernas and a few other groups, they permit the fact that now that they are listed, they subject themselves to the rules of level playing field. All shareholders, including other minorities, may make representations to regulators, and therefore, even state-owned enterprise through the corporatized entities has to respect the equality of shareholders' treatment. Now, this may be hard medicine for a state government of Kerala, right, being more left of center, whereas in Malaysia, we are more centrist, moving towards the right with communitarian affirmative action for the Bhumiputras. As I said, in terms of shareholders and effective remedy, I belong to a minority watchdog board, part of the thrust of the corporate governance initiative. And this group is sponsored by the Capital Development Market Fund, and we monitor through shareholder activism, through various AGMs and EGMs, which include state-owned enterprise listed, although there is some quizzical issues on that, I must confess, because EPF, being a pension board of ours, own various entities, and sometimes I think MSWG, the Minority Shareholder Watchdog officers, are a bit more tender vis-a-vis some of these companies. But the more private companies, the shareholder activism of Minority Share Watchdog is extremely active. These complementary efforts of Malaysia, I think, of quickening governance, has given rise to better outcomes in terms of state-owned enterprise. In terms of relationship with stakeholders, I think the Khazanah Group publishes strong, clear information. Earlier, I highlighted the growth of ROE in terms of their developments, and they have good disclosure and communication reporting. As to transparency and disclosure, once again, as I reiterate, because we are subjected to the discipline of the listing requirements, the listing requirements of the Bursa Malaysia, the stock exchange, is continuous disclosure and up to market Malaysian accounting standards, which are international, and so benchmark with best practices. And my final point, I have 5 minutes to round up, is I think one of the key issues that all state-owned enterprise, whether it's Asia or further, we need to look at how do we engender effective boards, because they are imperfect, though they may be, of being monitoring agents. They are the competencies of this board, the diversity that we are seeking. There is now a call for gender diversities, and I think we need to ask ourselves, how many of our state-owned enterprises boards have ladies? And I'm not here trying to ingratiate myself to ladies, though that's not a bad thing. But certainly diversity of skills and competencies. Training. Malaysia has focused on training by setting up directors' academies and strong impulse at one point, making training compulsory. But that became a little bit problematic, and therefore we eased it off. So training is extremely important. With those brief remarks, the Malaysian experience, I hope, will give rise to, beyond the debate of state-owned enterprise, we need to look at the process, not just the formal framing of it, but the procedures. And let us not make the mistake. I was reading the Hindu the other day flying in. We may try to follow, we still follow the law, but maybe not the procedures. I think both law and procedures and process, if efficacy, will be the next step for all state-owned enterprise, which would like to have successful outcomes in their activities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip. The next speaker is Mr. Michael Gillibrand from the United Kingdom. The brief note that's been prepared for me mentions him as a former advisor of the Commonwealth Secretariat, and that he has been a friend, philosopher, and guide to the state of Kerala for nearly 17 years. It is with his support, says my note, and vision that the Public Sector Restructuring and Internal Audit Board, which is the interface between the SOEs in Kerala and the government, was structured. He has trained professionals in the RIAB at the Commonwealth Secretariat in London and has done specific studies on a number of SOEs here. He has supported the government of Saudi Arabia, the reconstruction activities in Iraq, Afghanistan, and many countries in the Middle East and the North African region. He's a specialist in corporate governance and enterprise restructuring. Mr. Gillibrand.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The first thing I've got to cope with is the technology, and see if I can find the presentation. But while hoping that I can find that, or maybe some assistance will be coming from the floor, I would just say that it's a great pleasure for me to be back here in Kerala. As the chairman has mentioned, I first came out here in 1994 with the Commonwealth Secretariat, dealing with the restructuring of the public enterprises. And what I would like to certainly put on record is my admiration for the outstanding changes and success of the Ministry of Industries and REAB, which has been achieved over the last 15 years. I remember certainly back in 1994, the state enterprises faced enormous challenges. In those days, it was almost heresy to talk about the restructuring and the value of state enterprises. One certainly got into trouble with colleagues in some of the other international agencies, and a lot has changed then. However, today my task is to speak about Europe and European experiences of restructuring. And I'm still trying to see if I can cope with the technology. So otherwise I'm back on reconstruction in Africa. So my task is to talk about experiences in Europe. Thank you very much. And so in doing that, as you can